Bloober team has brought the medium here to PlayStation 5. We've covered this game in the past, both on Xbox Series consoles and PC, and we, back in the day, actually did like it quite a bit in spite of a variety of technical issues that it had. The game's changed since then, and on PlayStation 5, we're getting a slightly different package here, and to talk about it, I'm joined by my friend and colleague, John Linneman. How you doing there, John?
I'm doing good, Alex, and yeah, I covered the game originally on Xbox, and it's interesting. So now we have this PlayStation 5 version, and also the Xbox version has received numerous patches since launch as well. So it's in a slightly different state too. But you're the one that's been playing it on PlayStation 5.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about your experience there. I mean, I guess the first thing before we get to the technical details is, what does it actually bring to the table over the Xbox version, if anything? And what makes this like sort of a different version of the game?
Yeah, so here, one of the first things you'll notice when you play the game is the DualSense support that they've added into it. Pitter-patter of rain outside of a window, the howl of wind, or other atmospheric effects have been mapped to the haptic functions of the controller. So if you really like that kind of stuff, this game actually does use it quite a lot for a lot of things. It's not just straight up vibration. It is actually using it for atmospheric effects. Another thing they added in, and this one I think is a bit more subjective whether or not you'll like it, is gyro aiming when investigating objects. This game is kind of organized like a point-and-click adventure in a number of ways, where you examine an object and twist and turn it around and move the camera around. And honestly, for things like that, a mouse is pretty great. But a normal thumbstick can feel a little bit slow. You have the ability to use gyro aiming here, which is very reactive. It's obviously unsteady as a result. Like the camera, when you click on an object and you look at it, it is a little bit unsteady because you have to be used to using a gyro aim. But it is a nice way to enhance that area of the game and make it faster than just moving around with the thumbstick.
So that is optional, right? Because I'm not a fan of gyro aiming in games like this. So
I actually turned it off right away when I did my initial playthrough of this, because I just found it a little bit too hectic. It doesn't feel as good, honestly. Another thing that they added where I think it's less than positive change, interestingly, is there's a speaker built into the DualSense controller, and games use it for a variety of features. But here they've elected for some reason to, by default, have the echo dialogue and first-person perspective actions like cutting things or listening to audio in the first-person perspective to come through the controller instead of through your speaker. And I don't find that very positive because I don't like the audio that comes out of that speaker in general. It's very tinny and not too great sounding, and it doesn't mix as well with the environmental audio when that's happening. So that's something that this version does out the gate, and I actually didn't find very positive change.
Is that optional as well? Because the thing about that is that, if you're playing with headphones especially, you won't be able to hear the speaker coming from the controller, right?
If you're using headphones, it'll come through the headphones, but there's no way to switch it off if you're using speakers.
So, of the three new features, I feel like the DualSense support is by far the most interesting, and the other two, not exactly for me, but I'm sure some people will enjoy it.
Yeah, I think they're at least using the system, and that also bears out in the technical changes they've made to the game since last time, where it seems like they've used this almost a year amount of time since the Xbox version came out to, I would say, readjust what their priorities are for a console release.
Gotcha. Okay, so this is their second console release of the game then. Obviously, those are the new features they've added, but what about the actual visual differences? There's been some comparisons floating around, but it seems like there's quite a few changes made here. And it's some good things, some bad things, and it's more seems like a refocusing of what they want out of the game more than anything else.
Yeah, it is definitely that way. So I'm going to list off some things that I noticed that were changed right here, and they're going to sound slightly negative at first, but then we're going to get over to the effect of that on the overall game. And so bear with me here. So the first thing you'll notice on PlayStation 5 when you load it up is a slightly darker image. And this is not due to gamma differences. Yes, there are slight gamma differences between my recording footage here because, well, it's pretty hard to get the gamma to be perfectly aligned when recording always. But you'll notice that in the corners of images like this one you'll see here, there's added darkening now on this PlayStation 5 version. The reason for that is because the PlayStation 5 version switched off ray traced ambient occlusion and opted to use screen space ambient occlusion instead. So you'll get extra haloing effects and darkening. Now this is technically not physically accurate to the scene. It's not something you usually would want in a game, as ray traced ambient occlusion is more accurate, but that is something they've changed for this version. Another thing that they've changed are resolution of ray traced reflections. On Xbox Series X, as we look at this scene here, you can see that the resolution is higher than the PlayStation 5 version. When we compare to the PC version, using the same internal resolution here, like in this shot here on Xbox Series X, it's around 1080p. We can see that in comparison to the PC version, the Xbox Series X uses 0.5 axis scale resolution here. On the PlayStation 5 version, matched internal resolution, we can see that the axis scale is 0.25 for the ray traced reflections. So they've reduced the resolution of ray traced reflections.
Wow, that's interesting too, because the game didn't originally ship with ray tracing at all.
No, it did not. So they added this in.
Another thing though that's interesting about this game is that I noticed that in the Xbox version, ray traced reflections were only used on very specific surfaces, and that SSR was still used heavily in many other areas of the game. I assume that's still the same.
Yeah, it is still the same. So there, like when you're outside the hospital resort area, for example, you can definitely see that they are using SSR there, much like you found in your video back in the day. So it still has that same divide, I would say, of using SSR and not using SSR, like we saw in the original Xbox version. Another major visual change is that you can see it pretty well in the opening chapter of the game. You go into this shot here, for example, and you can see on the Xbox and PC versions, there's manually placed lights in this hallway here that are used to simulate light bounce. Essentially, there's like two lights, one at the end of the hallway and one at the forefront of the hallway near the door you just came out of. It gives the room essentially a bit of brighter light, bounce light. They don't actually have like real-time global illumination or something like that. On the PlayStation 5 version, they've removed these lights, and those obviously are things that, you know, are performance impacting. So we'll get to that very soon. The last smaller change, one that is less visible in most scenes, I would say, excluding a few, is that the PlayStation 5 version also reduced the shadow resolution for the shadow maps used in the game. So they're a bit blockier, like you see here, and filtered, a bit worse, or, you know, like here you can see that the Xbox version uses like the middle setting for shadows, the PC uses the high setting, and the PlayStation 5 uses essentially a lower setting than both of those.
Okay, that's a lot of changes actually.
It looks on the surface like they're just downgrading things, but when you get into the game and are playing it itself, other than I would say the SSAO change, which I'd say is an overall negative, most of these other things do not get in the way. You're not really noticing them too often. I really only noticed the shadow reduction. For example, in one scene when I was moving back and forth in front of a light, and I thought like, oh, this looks a bit blockier than I remember. And then I looked, and then it was. So I would say in general, these aren't that large of a changes usually. And it has a pretty dramatic effect on the visual output of the game. And this comes back to your original video, John, here, where back in the day you measured like the Xbox Series X version had a very, I would say, well, at least now, has a more dramatic change in resolution from scene to scene. And on PlayStation 5, it's quite opposite the case. And it's very interesting. I ran through the initial first chapter of this game, and I recorded, as you can see here, a list of resolutions when each camera would cut.
That's actually very useful about, you know, a game like this specifically, is because the fixed camera angles mean it's constantly changing cameras, and every time the scene switches, you get a raw image without the TAA applied. So perfect for pixel counting.
It's awesome for us. And as you can see with this list of resolutions here, the PlayStation 5 version has a very, very consistent internal resolution. It's usually 1728p on all these camera cuts. You know, there's a couple that are slightly lower resolution, but on the Xbox side, it's generally around 1440p and much more variable, going below 1440p, almost down to 1080p in a number of instances. And that bears out when you just look at the game. It's sitting still, not on camera cuts. The PlayStation 5 version looks higher res and crisper in general when you look up at the details, like the texture details or the character moving slightly side by side. In general, I've always found with Unreal Engine 4's version of temporal anti-aliasing upsampling that around the 1728p resolution, I would say about 1620p or so or higher, it starts looking really a lot like 4K. So the PlayStation 5 version looks very 4K-like, where in areas I would say the Xbox Series X version does not. This is interesting because we're seeing a game here that is higher res with different settings on the PlayStation 5 version, and it brings up this subjective question of what is actually preferred, right, John?
Yeah, that's kind of the interesting thing here, is it seems like they've essentially implemented the equivalent of a quality versus performance mode without the choice. So which I think fundamentally would be a good option for this game. But clearly they decided that pushing all these extra visual effects but dropping the resolution was perhaps not worth it at this point, and they opted for a crisper, higher resolution presentation, which kind of makes sense given the aesthetic of this game with a lot of the harder edges and everything. But, you know, effectively while you're playing the game, from looking at your shots, it doesn't seem to too greatly impact the overall visual experience, and that the higher resolution ends up just creating a better looking version of the game in the end. But I think the important thing to take away from this is this isn't really a comparison of, oh, this console is better than this other console. It's more just a difference of settings that they've just opted to change the way the game looks. And I'd be curious to hear their actual like behind the scenes reasoning, and whether they originally tested the game, I assume, with the original settings on Xbox and then decided to scale things back, or whether they were simply driven by the desire to render the game at a higher overall resolution.
I would be curious to know that as well too. And like you, I would say that minus the SSAO edition, I actually find a lot of these changes here awesome, because they don't affect a majority of the camera views in this game, a majority of the graphical presentation, and they allow for the game to render at this higher resolution now. And I find it more pleasing. There was a number of moments when just replaying the Xbox Series X version here where I would see it fizzle really heavily after a camera cut. And that really doesn't happen on the PlayStation 5 version, and it leads to a more seamless experience. And I found that generally great. So it is curious that they made this change.
This is fundamentally what it means to optimize a game on a console, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is what it's about. Beyond the actual low level, you know, or actually coding the game, once you're up and running like this, especially using like Unreal, it is about tweaking these types of settings and determining your render budget per frame and kind of making those decisions to create the best looking game you can, but while targeting a certain performance profile. And that's what they've done here.
Yeah, and I think it's has a positive look for the overall visual output of the game, and I would like almost actually see what you said earlier, where I would like if there was a quality mode and maybe a resolution mode or something like that, where this version of the game is called like resolution mode, and whatever the Xbox Series X version is called quality mode, and you could have an offering for both of those on consoles, just because, you know, it's always good to have choice for those who would maybe like to have RTAO or something like that, or higher res reflections. That's always nice to have.
Okay, but what about performance then? Because when I played it on Xbox, I did note that there was some issues with inconsistent frame pacing, as well as some actual slowdowns during certain sequences of the game. Firstly, has it actually improved on Xbox? And more importantly, what is it like on PlayStation 5?
So on Xbox Series X, I did play through the first and second chapters of the game, and I did notice that, first of all, the improper frame pacing that you described back then, where essentially you would have long and short frames and things like that, and it leads to a jerky visual experience, that is primarily gone on the Xbox Series X. There was one issue when I did load it up where occasionally there would be drop frames for reasons I could not explain, but it wasn't a frame pacing issue. It was actually real dropped frames. So I'm not sure what was causing that, but in general, the overall performance of the presentation was much higher, much less drops than you saw in that initial launch version. There were still some though, like when you'd get a camera angle change, or in this cutscene right here, there were still some drops. That is really about it. It is actually a pretty okay 30 FPS presentation now. PlayStation 5 is a bit different. Now, I would say nominally, before I even show the frame time graph here, PlayStation 5 version is an extremely solid 30 FPS. There's basically not too many drops at all that are real drops. The only issue is it seems to have inherited, for no reason that I can think of, the improper frame pacing the initial launch version of Xbox Series X had. It is very solid, but every single time you're doing anything, and I just show this back to back with the Xbox Series X version here, it's just constantly having this frame pacing issue, which at a 30 FPS cinematic presentation with the camera slowly gliding along the scenery here, it really shows out, and you can really see this kind of jerky camera movement. Unfortunately, I honestly don't know why this is. They learned back then, and they fixed it on Xbox, and here it is launching on PlayStation 5 with that same issue. It's a shame. It's a real shame.
I don't understand how these issues keep slipping through. It's absolutely mind-boggling. We know that it can be done without this problem, but alas, here it is again. So yeah, that's unfortunate then.
Bloober really needs to fix this. I'm going to just understress this as much as possible. PlayStation 5 version performance is great, but they need to fix the improper frame pacing. Another thing that's slightly mind-boggling that doesn't line up with the performance specs are loading. Here's the initial load, for example, of the game on PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, and PC. PC, finishes in about 10 seconds, Xbox Series X in 13 seconds, and it took about 20 seconds to start show the initial area of the game on PlayStation 5. There's almost no reason this should be the case. We know that the CPU in the PlayStation 5 is almost the exact same as that which we have in the Series X. It has a faster SSD. Even if they're not using the low-level APIs here, which they are obviously not on all of these systems, it shouldn't be loading that much slower.
Yeah.
I did not find this that big of a deal, usually, because this game is not loading too often, but there is a scene later on in the game where you can die multiple times really quickly, to say the least, and when that was loading, it definitely slowed down the pace of the game and made it feel a lot less next gen when you're just waiting, and then you have to start up again and wait. And I don't know. It seems a bit weird that this once again is another thing that slipped through when we know the PlayStation 5 can load things very quickly.
That is so strange. Yeah. So it kind of feels like the game came in very hot.
Yes.
Between these issues you've mentioned here, plus the fact that it initially shipped without ray tracing support, it feels like it probably should have been released, a month or two later.
I'd agree with that. But in the end, looking at it as a holistic package, I think Bloober made the right choice to be less ambitious with certain visual features and instead prioritize the resolution and performance, because it performs in generally better than what we see on the Xbox Series X, and it is higher res overall, leading to a much more pleasing, stable image. And I almost hope that becomes an option that they add to the Series X version down the line for people still playing that version of the game. But other than that, a bit weird. Frame pacing issues make the game eminently less cinematic looking than other versions of the game, and it's a real shame, and they need to fix it. But John, thank you so much for talking to me about the Medium on PlayStation 5.
Sure thing, Alex.
And if you did like this video and found it informative, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out and see more content like this in the future, support us on Patreon to get years worth of our content in high quality for download. Want to talk to John, or I guess me, about the Medium on all of these systems? Write a comment below or follow John and myself on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex, bidding you auf Wiedersehen und
keep on bloobing it up.